The rhetoric surrounding refugees and migrants has become increasingly polarized over the last decade. Now, the global recession exacerbated feelings of economic and social dislocation for the working and middle class in many countries. Now, tapping into these real and perceived feelings of loss, politicians on the far right in many countries have combined populist economic policies with native worldviews, using immigrants and refugees as scapegoats for changing economic realities. Now, refugees and migrants more broadly are painted as a drain on national resources. But how true is this? Now, in celebration of World Refugee Day, we are joined by Ashimwe, the Regional Refugee Director at Ingomokos, and Juliena, Oyler, the CEO of African Entreprenuer Collective. For more, I want to start with you, Juliena. What are the economics around refugees and host countries?
Arnold, thank you so much for having us and for your willingness to engage in a conversation around private sector development in refugee communities. As an overview, African Entreprenuer Collective has been working with refugees since 2016, first starting out in Rwanda under the brand Inkomoko. And building on the success that we had in Rwanda, we expanded as AEC Kenya into Turkana County that hosts the Kakuma refugee camp and Kalobe integrated settlement. And then even earlier, just this month, we opened up another office in Garissa County that hosts the Dadaab refugee complex. And AEC currently works in 11 refugee hosting communities, and these economies are incredibly diverse, ranging from an 8,000 person agrarian society to a 200,000 person market, turning over more than 56 million US dollars a year in annual consumption. And a common misconception, as you rightfully stated, is that refugees are consumers, that they're completely reliant on donor aid and host government support. And yes, refugees still need humanitarian assistance, but refugees and their communities are also producers. They're businesses connected to much larger supply chains. Refugees are employees and they're employers. And acknowledging that these economies exist is the first step in leveraging the power of these markets. And that's why we're really excited to have this conversation today.
Oliver, I want to bring you into the conversation there. The misconception regarding refugees and host countries. And I want to give Kenya as an example. You have the Somalia community that has been in Kenya for for quite some time there, and Kenya has come out to say they're going to close one of the biggest refugee centers in the world that has been inhabiting these people, and they're saying there's a large dependency on this. What's the correlation between donor agencies, the likes of the UN, and a host country like Kenya?
Thank you, Arnold, and thank you for that question and having us speak to the big cause. I will touch from the angle of partnership. When we look at refugees or when we look at host countries, it's more looking at them as partners in economic development. It's enabling refugees who are in Turkana, who are in Garissa County, as not only consumers, but also looking at them as economic actors, as value chain, as employees, as employers. So definitely offering a big policy framework. Is it repatriation? Is it integration? But all in all, looking at refugees as part of economic actors and not just consumers, dependent, heavy and burden, but rather as partners and eco-contributors when it comes to matters of economic development. And so I'll look at it as that angle. And of course, governments have different playing priorities, but when we're looking at refugees, it's competition of resources. It's looking at what can be done when resources are scarce.
Oliver, just want to stay with you, and as you can imagine, this story is very relatable to me. Usually when I'm having conversations with my grandfather, he talks about their time when they were refugees in neighboring Uganda. And one of the things they were denied during that time were, the basics, IDs, services, the host country accepting them to be integrated, to be given basics like land, to tilt and to be able to survive. Now, some countries have changed this policy, Rwanda being an example. Yeah, but how come it hasn't been transferred by or picked up by other countries which are still pushing heavily against this?
Yeah, and Arnold, we share that. So my grandparents also share the same and have gone through that. So what I look at and really what has been done that we acknowledge as an organization is the big comprehensive refugee response framework, which all the government that we work with are signatory to. And that gives refugees the right to work, the right to movement, the right to resources, the right to education. However, when we go to implementation, when we go to citizens of these countries, there is still work that needs to be done. But when the right framework is given, and I'm glad you talked about Uganda, it's one of the countries that has good policies currently vis-a-vis refugees, and Rwanda being another good example in terms of hosting and integrating refugees into national systems. But overall, I look at a lot has been done, a lot can still be done, but overall it's offering a right framework that gives refugees and their host communities a partnership relationship rather than a dependence one.
Julian, I want to bring you into the conversation. Olive mentions a very good point there regarding challenges around implementation. Now, how do you overcome these challenges and ensure that those good policies actually translate into something?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And over the last 5 years, AEC has worked with more than 25,000 businesses in refugee communities. These businesses have generated more than $25 million in new revenue circulating in these economies. And currently, these businesses employ over 100,000 people, right? And this data alone demonstrates that refugees can be real economic contributors when given the tools to succeed. And one of the things that we do at African Entrepreneur Collective in Rwanda, Kenya, and soon to be Ethiopia, is that we provide really practical business development support services, the same that any business, in any parts of the world needs. They need to better understand financial management, understand operations, sales, and also they need investments. So in addition to providing capacity building, we also put our money where our mouths are, and we do direct investment into refugee businesses. And so seeing refugees, entrepreneurs as viable businesses working in really vibrant markets, that's the key to implementation. Seeing that these businesses need all of the same support services that any other market needs is key in order for us to really leverage their talents, see business growth, and utilize that for drivers of economic development in these communities.
Olive, bringing you back into the conversation, you mentioned as well implementation there being a challenge, but Julian is giving us examples. How do you ensure that there's accountability with the examples she's giving us?
Yeah, accountability also plays to both angles. It's when the refugees are coming in, giving them the right framework that allows them to work, that allows them to run successful businesses, the tools, the access to finance, the follow-ups that we do at African Entrepreneur Collective, but also it's passing on the message of the expectations. So refugees not only are running businesses for self-reliance, for sustainability and improving livelihoods, but also contributing to taxes into hosting countries, but also working with the governments in each country to increase accountability, to also speak to the truth to refugees and host communities that, yes, they're providing jobs, they're improving their livelihoods, and this is what is expected, and this is what we are providing. So I look at it from that angle of shared or mutual accountability when it comes to these policies being implemented across different relevant stakeholders and partners, and of course the people of concern who are refugees and host communities.
Olive, I want to stay with you, and Julian, please piggyback off Olive regarding this. I want to talk about a very important issue there, that's labor exploitation. Now, the United Nations has noted that refugees are some of the people that experience the most exploitation when it comes to the labor market. In fact, this is among the challenges. It tracks in about 87% of the refugees in developing countries are seen as exploited by the labor. Now, the UNHCR Convention, and this is from 1951, it notes a right to work for refugees. Now, only 50% of the countries that are hosting refugees or asylum seekers are implementing this currently, or less than 50% actually. Now, how do you ensure that countries are held liable, governments are held liable, while at the same time keeping them accepting of the refugees?
Yeah, I think the first thing is really to as Julian shared, some of the learnings we've had, the revenues that these businesses have generated, the jobs that these businesses have generated. We have over 7,000 jobs that have been created, and 2/3 of those jobs are filled by locals. So when we advance such big statistics, such big data to government, then there is a mind shift rather than going, oh, you have to implement what you signed up for. So I'll look at as implementing partners, bringing on fact on the table, and rather, yes, there is an advocacy that needs to be done on behalf of refugees. There is an advocacy that needs to be done in terms of just sharing a simple story. Last week I was in Addis, and one of the MFIs, they know that refugees in Ethiopia have the right to having access to finance. So yes, there is that needs to be done, but what has happened to the over 6,000 businesses that have received access to finance from AEC? And what have they contributed into their immediate communities? So I look at it from, we do advocacy, but we also do factors, and the two will come to change the narrative around refugees and host communities.
And it's good that you bring in the narrative. Julian, as you answer that, please, how do you reposition that narrative regarding refugees being seen as, economic burdens and rather not economic contributors?
Yeah, Arnold, I think this is a really important point. And, it's much easier to exploit labor and to use sort of bad business practices when things aren't regulated. And so, the example that you gave of refugees being very vulnerable and also having challenges, I think is a great reason why we need to help formalize refugees into our employment systems, into our national systems. And you're correct that the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees is not being followed by as many member states as need be. But in 2019, UN states came together and unanimously approved the new Global Compact on Refugees, where countries, especially hosting countries, made pledges to integrate refugees into their national services in a much more robust way. So there's a lot of hope in the future that we will be able to support refugees and integrate refugees into hosting countries in a much more holistic way. But as Olive mentioned, I think there's something that's said, at national levels, but then what happens at the ground is there's still a disconnect. And the way that we as an organization can support governments is to be providing accurate data, reliable data, showing that refugees are contributing to taxes, showing the number of host community members that are employed by refugee businesses. And then also, it's not just the government that needs to bring refugees more into inclusive policies. It's also on us as private sector institutions. The data that we have showing that refugees are repaying loans at 98% is hopefully an incentive to other financial institutions to see refugees as viable borrowers. It's also for us as private sector industries to see refugees as key components of longer supply chains. So, when we all work together in partnership to show opportunities for these refugee communities to be able to see how we can leverage their talents into larger economic development strategies, that's the way that we're actually going to protect refugees and help these communities in a much more sustainable way.
Thank you very much there, Julian. Olive, just before we let you go, Ingomoko is doing some amazing work around refugees in Rwanda. I want you to highlight and give us an example of what you are doing specifically to change that narrative.
Yeah, glad Really happy to talk about that. So what we do and how we support micro, small and medium enterprises in Rwanda, both refugees and host communities, is to offer them business development services. And that sounds broad, but it's in practice giving them the tools to be able to track inventory, to be able to know money in, money out, to be able to offer them one-on-one consulting with our staff, but also to offer them affordable access to finance. We know there could be a whole disconnect between you've received big business development services, but there is access to finance. And we are also pleased to say that when COVID hit, which was a big shock to many businesses, we were able to offer a one-off grant to support these businesses to come back to where, at least somewhere before COVID. And we were able to do that, which was a one-off grant in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation in Rwanda, but also with a Care Foundation in Kenya. And this has seen businesses that were affected by movement restrictions, by supply chain disruption, come back to normal, come back to close or pivot where it makes sense to pivot. Yeah.